If you've ever dealt with a Karen, you'll know the type loud, entitled, convinced the world owes them everything. But what you're about to hear is a story that went far beyond petty arguments or nasty notes, turned into a battle for my safety, my property, and ultimately my peace of mind. So before I dive into how I ended up staring down a neighbor who thought she owned my family's legacy, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, so you don't want to miss tales like this, where arrogance meets reality, and justice isn't always what they expected. It began one Friday evening when I was out splitting wood by the cabin, enjoying the last golden rays of sunlight spilling across the lake, when my phone buzzed with a message from Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Her text wasn't a request. It was an order typed out like she was my landlord. "Bring the key. I'm using your cabin this weekend." I froze, staring at the words, rereading them just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. My cabin wasn't just some vacation rental or unused property. It had been in my family for 90 years. Passed from grandfather to father to me, a place where every beam and board carried memories, where weekends meant quiet mornings by the water and evenings by the fire. And here she was demanding the key like it was a community clubhouse she could book at will. I typed back a single word, "No." Within minutes, my phone lit up again, this time with a stream of angry messages. She accused me of being selfish, of denying community access. And she even tried to claim that the HOA had jurisdiction over my property, which it absolutely did not. I ignored the nonsense until she sent one final text. "You'll regret this." It was meant to scare me, but all it did was harden my resolve. I wasn't about to hand over the keys to a stranger who thought rules bent to her whims. That night, I told Emily, my wife, about the texts, and though she was shocked, she wasn't surprised. Karen had already tried smaller stunts demanding we repaint the cabin in HOA-approved colors, insisting we remove the old dock because it ruined the lake's aesthetic, and even suggesting that our family photos on the porch made the place look unwelcoming. We had laughed her off before, but this was different. This was her trying to walk into our home. The next morning, I was chopping more wood when I saw her storming up the driveway, heels clicking against the gravel like she was marching to battle. She didn't even bother greeting me, just thrust her hand out like I should slap the key into it. "Told you," she snapped. "I need the cabin this weekend. My son and his friends are coming in from out of state, and the community has always shared resources." I set the axe down slowly, wiped my hands on my jeans, and stared at her. "This cabin isn't community property, Karen. It's mine. It's been mine for decades, and it'll stay that way. You're not getting the key." Her face twisted, lips curling like she'd bitten into something sour. And she raised her voice so loud it echoed off the trees. "You don't get to decide that. If you won't hand it over, I'll make sure you regret it. I'll call the cops. I'll call the board. I'll make your life miserable." She was trembling with fury, waiting for me to cave. But instead, I walked over to the porch, leaned inside, and pulled out my hunting rifle. Not pointing it at her, not waving it recklessly, but holding it firmly in my hands the way my father had taught me, calm and steady. "This," I said, my voice low and even, "is how serious I am about protecting my home. Don't mistake my kindness for weakness." For the first time since I'd known her, Karen went pale. Her bravado flickered, her eyes darting between me and the rifle. And though she tried to keep her chin high, the quiver in her voice gave her away when she muttered, "You'll regret this," before turning on her heel and storming back down the drive. I stood there long after she'd gone, the rifle still in my hands, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of it all. I hadn't threatened high, never would, but I had made it clear. My home was not up for debate, not for rent, not for her entitled games. That night, Emily and I sat by the fire. She asked if I thought Karen was really done, if showing her the rifle had scared her enough to back down. I wanted to believe it had, but deep down I knew Karen wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. She was the kind who stewed, who plotted, who came back twice as loud and twice as reckless. And sure enough, before the weekend was even over, the sound of engines on the gravel woke us up early Sunday morning. I pulled back the curtain to see not just Karen, but 3 cars parked in the drive. Her son and his friends stepping out with bags like they already owned the place. My blood ran hot. but as I looked at them swaggering toward the porch with Karen barking orders, I realized this was only the beginning of a storm that would test every ounce of patience, strength, and grit I had in me, because Karen wasn't just trying to take a cab, and she was trying to take control of everything I stood for. And I knew then and there I was ready to fight back with everything I had. When I stepped outside onto the porch that Sunday morning, Karen's son and his buddies were already hauling coolers and duffel bags up the steps like they owned the place. And Karen herself was barking orders from the gravel drive, her voice shrill as she directed them to put their things in the guest rooms, make sure the grill on the back deck was cleaned before dinner. I didn't move at first, just stood there with my arms crossed, watching them all pretend this was some kind of vacation home they had rented, until Karen finally noticed me, and her expression twisted into that smug smile she wore whenever she thought she had the upper hand. "Oh, don't mind us," she called out, her hand waving casually. "The community voted, and we're making use of this property. You'll be compensated later if you insist, but for now, hand me the key and let us get settled." The audacity of it all hit me like a punch in the gut. I walked down the steps, closing the space between us, and told her flatly that there had been no vote, no agreement, and no circumstance under which she or anyone else had permission to step inside. Her son, a tall man in his late 20s with Karen's sharp eyes, laughed as if I were the punchline to a bad joke and said, "Look, old man, you can either make this easy or we'll just do it ourselves." His friends chuckled in the background, clearly emboldened by the thought that Karen's so-called authority somehow extended to me. That was the moment I realized they had come ready to force the issue, and my pulse hammered with both fear and fury. I told them all to stop right there and step off my porch, but Karen shoved forward, trying to grab the knob of the front door like she could will it open. I blocked her path, and she gasped in mock offense, clutching her chest dramatically as if I had shoved her. "Assault. Did you see that?" she shrieked, turning to her entourage. "He just assaulted me. Call the police." One of her son's friends actually pulled out his phone, but I snapped at him that he'd better think twice before dialing a false report. That's when I reached just inside the door and pulled the rifle into view again, holding it at my side but angled enough that they could all see it. I didn't raise it, didn't point it at them, but the sight of it sucked the laughter right out of the air. Karen's son stopped mid-step, his grin dying on his lips, and even Karen herself faltered, her hand frozen on the doorknob. "This is your one and only warning," I said, my voice low and steady. "This cabin is not your vacation spot. It is my family's home. And if you don't step off this property right now, you'll be trespassing in full view of a camera and in violation of the law. And believe me, when the cops arrive, it won't be me they're hauling off." For a moment, the only sound was the wind stirring the trees and the distant lap of the lake against the shore. Then Karen tried again, her voice trembling but still trying for that iron edge. You wouldn't dare. I have the board's backing. I have the right," but even her son wasn't convinced anymore. He muttered something about not wanting to spend the weekend in jail and started backing off the porch. His friends followed suit, glaring at me, but clearly unwilling to push their luck, and finally Karen herself retreated, spitting out promises that I would pay for this insolence and that I was finished in this community. I stood my ground until they piled back into their cars and drove away, gravel spraying behind their tires. And only when the sound of engines faded did I let out the breath I had been holding. Emily came out onto the porch then, her eyes wide, her face pale, and she asked if I really thought this was over. I shook my head slowly and told her the truth. It was just beginning. Over the next few days, Karen launched a full-scale smear campaign. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of being dangerous, unstable, a menace with a gun who threatened families. She called an emergency HOA meeting where she stood at the front of the room, waving her arms and telling anyone who would listen that I was a danger to the neighborhood, that I needed to be disciplined for brandishing weapons against the community. Some people nodded along out of fear or loyalty, but others whispered in corners, skeptical of her exaggerated theatrics. A neighbor named Tom pulled me aside after the meeting and quietly said he believed me, that he'd had his own run-ins with Karen, and he urged me to start keeping detailed records of every encounter, every threat, Emily and I did exactly that. We photographed the flyers, recorded Karen's rants when she showed up at the edge of our yard yelling across the fence, and logged every harassing text and call. And still, Karen pushed harder. One evening, as the sun set pink across the lake, 2 police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing, and officers stepped out, saying they'd received a report of a man with a rifle threatening neighbors. I walked them calmly through the entire story, showed them the footage from my security cameras, and handed them the folder of evidence we had been compiling. The officers exchanged looks, clearly realizing they had been played, and one even muttered that this wasn't the first false call from Karen they had responded to. They left without issue. But the warning was clear. Karen wasn't above using law enforcement as her personal weapon. Next time, things could go very differently if I wasn't careful. That night, Emily sat with me by the fire, her voice shaking as she asked if maybe it was time to leave the cabin behind. If fighting this war was worth the stress, the risk, the sleepless nights. I pulled her close and told her I wouldn't let Karen chase us off the land my grandfather had built with his own hands. This was our legacy, and I'd fight tooth and nail to protect it. But even as I said the words, I felt the chill of what was coming, because Karen wasn't done. It's not even close. The following week was nothing short of psychological warfare, because Karen, having failed to seize the cabin physically, doubled down with intimidation tactics that tested our patience and resolve day after day. It started with her parking her SUV across the driveway early each morning so that I couldn't get my truck out without confronting her. And when I walked outside to tell her to move, she would sit behind the wheel with her sunglasses on, recording me with her phone, muttering, just loud enough for the camera to pick it up, that I was threatening her again. One afternoon, I caught her son spray painting the words "community property" across the old wooden gate that led to the dock. And when I chased him off, Karen appeared 5 minutes later screaming at the top of her lungs that I had attacked her child, though he was a grown man well past his 20s. Each time, I thought I'd seen the depths of her spite. She found a way to crawl deeper, and Emily's nerves began to fray under the constant strain. She jumped at shadows, grew wary of leaving the house alone, and at night, she confessed, she dreamt of flames consuming the cabin, of waking to the smell of smoke. I reassured her that I had secured the place as best I could, with cameras and floodlights and locks on every entry. But in my heart, I knew her fears weren't unfounded. Brand of vindictiveness wasn't bound by reason, and I could see how badly she wanted to break us. The turning point came one evening when I returned from town to find the sheriff's cruiser parked in front of the cabin, lights still flashing faintly in the dusk. My stomach dropped as I pulled up behind him, thinking maybe Karen had finally pushed things too far. The sheriff stepped out, a weary expression on his face, and said, "We got another call. Said you were threatening neighbors with a firearm again." I clenched my fists but kept my voice even, telling him to come inside and see the evidence for himself. I showed him the security footage from earlier that afternoon, which clearly displayed Karen and her son trespassing across the yard, shouting at Emily through the window, and Emily refusing to open the door. There was no weapon in sight, no confrontation beyond them, spewing insults and stomping away when they realized Emily wasn't engaging. The sheriff sighed heavily, saying it was the 4th false report in as many weeks, and he was sick of wasting manpower on Karen's vendetta. He promised me he'd file a report noting the pattern of harassment, which gave me some relief. But I also knew Karen would spin it to the board however she wanted. And sure enough, the very next day a letter appeared taped to our porch railing, stamped with the HOA's seal, declaring that we were being fined $5,000 for endangering community safety and brandishing firearms against neighbors. I crumpled it in my fist and laughed bitterly, because there was no clause in the HOA's charter that gave them authority over my cabin, but the sheer gall of them acting as though they did made my blood boil. Emily urged me not to pay it, not to acknowledge it, and I agreed. But I also knew Karen was baiting me into a legal battle where she thought she could bury us in paperwork and debt. I refused to play her game. Instead, I doubled down on gathering evidence. I installed additional cameras, both visible and hidden, set up audio recorders near the driveway, kept a logbook where I wrote down every single interaction in excruciating detail. Friends like Tom and a few other neighbors who were tired of Karen's antics began coming forward, two offering written statements about how she had harassed them, fined them without cause, and even threatened to revoke their membership in the community when they pushed back. It was becoming clearer by the day that Karen's empire was crumbling. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Karen wasn't about to go down quietly. That Friday, as Emily and I were sitting by the fire pit, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, Karen stormed into the yard without warning, shouting that we had until Monday to hand over the key to the cabin or face serious consequences. I stood up, my patience gone, and told her that if she didn't leave immediately, I would call the sheriff myself. She smirked, leaning in close enough that I could smell the bitterness of wine on her breath, and whispered, "You think that rifle scared me? You think you're safe? I'll burn this place down before I let you win." My blood ran cold at the words, and before I could react, she spun on her heel and stalked back toward the road, her voice carrying through the trees as she muttered threats to herself. Emily gripped my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin, her eyes wide with terror, and I realized that Karen wasn't bluffing anymore. The games, the lies, the false reports, they were all building toward something darker. And unless I found a way to stop her, we were headed straight for a disaster we might not walk away from. That night, I barely slept, lying awake with the rifle across my lap and the cameras feeding live to my phone, knowing Karen's war had crossed a line from nuisance to danger. The weekend passed with a tension so thick, it felt like every creak of the old cabin was a warning. Every gust of wind across the lake, a whisper of danger. And by Sunday evening, Emily and I were running on nerves and coffee, too wired to relax, and too afraid to let our guard down. We kept the lights low, the doors bolted, and the cameras rolling. Because Karen's words, "I'll burn this place down before I let you win," echoed in my mind like a curse. I tried to tell myself it was just another bluff, another attempt to scare us into handing over the key, but in my gut I knew she meant it. On Monday morning, I drove into town to speak with the sheriff directly, laying out every piece of evidence. We'd gathered and repeating Karen's threat word for word. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and admitted that while her harassment was undeniable, without hard proof of her intent to follow through, they couldn't do much more than keep an eye on things.
Document everything.
Told me again, and if anything happens, you'll have a solid case. I wanted to demand more, but I also knew his hands were tied. When I returned to the cabin, I found Emily pale and shaken on the porch. She told me Karen had been there while I was gone, circling the yard with her phone out, filming the cabin and muttering about evidence for the board. Emily said she tried to ignore her, but Karen had stood at the edge of the porch steps, shouting insults and threats for nearly an hour before finally stomping away. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to storm over to her house and end this once and for all. I knew that was exactly what she wanted, something she could twist into another accusation. Instead, I spent the afternoon checking the fire extinguishers, clearing brush from around the cabin, and setting up motion sensors near the shed and woodpile. That night, as the sun dipped low, the air thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of loons on the lake, Emily whispered that she didn't feel safe here anymore. She begged me to consider leaving for a while, at least until Karen cooled down. But I couldn't stomach the thought of abandoning the place my grandfather had built with his bare hands, of letting Karen think she had one. I promised her I would keep us safe, though even as I said it, I felt the weight of the promise pressing hard against my chest. And then, just before midnight, the sound came sharp, cracking, wrong. I bolted upright from the couch where I'd been dozing, the glow of the fire still flickering low in the hearth, and Emily gasped from the bedroom. The motion sensor had triggered, and on the phone screen beside me, the camera feed showed a figure moving across the yard toward the shed. Heart pounding, I grabbed the rifle and stepped to the window. Pulling back the curtain, just enough to see Karen's son in the pale wash of the security lights, a gas can in one hand and a lighter glinting in the other. Rage and terror surged through me in equal measure, and I yanked the door open, shouting his name across the yard. He froze, caught in the beam of the camera and the weight of my voice. and for a long moment he just stood there, staring back at me like a deer in headlights. Then he dropped the can and bolted, sprinting into the woods where the shadows swallowed him whole. I rushed to the shed, the smell of gasoline already stinging my nose, and found the grass damp where he'd spilled it, the can lying on its side. Emily clutched my arm, her voice trembling as she asked if I'd called the sheriff, and I nodded, already dialing with shaking fingers. Within 20 minutes the cruiser pulled up, lights flashing across the yard, and I led the sheriff straight to the shed, pointing out the gas can, the footprints in the dirt, the camera footage. He reviewed it all with a grim face, then told me he'd bring the son in for questioning. But Karen herself showed up not 10 minutes later, storming out of her car with her hair wild and her eyes blazing, screaming that I was framing her family, that her son was at home asleep. The sheriff didn't buy it. Not this time. Not with the footage right there in his hands, but even as he promised me charges would be filed. Karen shrieked promises of revenge so vile that Emily had to pull me back inside just to keep me from lunging at her. That night we barely slept, the adrenaline still coursing through us, every creak of the old floorboards making us jump. But I also felt something new burning in my chest. Resolve. Karen had escalated this war to fire and gasoline, and if she thought that would scare us off, she was dead wrong. What she had done instead was cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, a line that meant sooner or later she would answer for everything she had done. And as I sat there with Emily huddled close, the rifle resting across my knees, I knew the next chapter of this fight wouldn't be fought in the shadows of our cabin yard. It would be fought in a courtroom.
Under the
Hard light of truth. The days after Karen's son was caught with the gas can felt like walking a tightrope strung over fire. Because while the sheriff assured us charges were being prepared, we both knew that Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She wasn't the type to retreat and lick her wounds. She was the type to double down, to spin lies into truths so loudly and so often that weaker minds began to believe her. By Tuesday morning, the rumors had already begun to spread, neighbors whispering that I had staged the whole thing, that I had poured the gasoline myself to frame her son, that I was desperate to paint myself as a victim because I couldn't handle being part of the community. Karen fanned the flames herself, marching from house to house, waving copies of the HOA's fine notice like it was holy scripture, shouting that she would personally see me evicted from the cabin by the end of the month. But for all her bluster, the cracks were showing. Tom and several other neighbors who had dealt with her harassment before started speaking up more openly, sharing their own stories of false fines, intimidation, and manipulative threats. One woman admitted Karen had threatened to revoke her access to the community pool because she refused to donate to Karen's pet project. Another man revealed that Karen had written him up for having a flagpole that was too tall. Despite there being no rule about it, slowly but surely people were beginning to see through her facade. Still, her core group of loyalists held fast, and they were loud enough to keep the pressure on. On Wednesday afternoon, as Emily and I were stacking firewood, Karen herself stormed into the yard again, this time with 2 board members in tow. She pointed at me like a prosecutor in court, shrieking that I had terrorized her family and demanding that the board immediately seize the cabin for community safety. One of the board members, a meek man with glasses who always seemed afraid of Karen, muttered something about reviewing the bylaws, while the other, an older woman named Margaret, folded her arms and said coldly, "This isn't HOA jurisdiction, Karen, and you know it." The look on Karen's face when Margaret said that was priceless, like someone had yanked the rug out from under her. But she recovered quickly, hissing that Margaret was just as corrupt as I was, and that she would see them all in court. That night, sitting by the fire with Emily, I realized Karen was right about one thing. This was going to court. And that was where we had the advantage, because we had evidence mountains of it, while all she had were lies. Over the next week, we prepared like soldiers heading to battle. I cataloged every video clip, every photo, every log entry, and organized them into binders so thick they could have brained someone if thrown. Emily gathered statements from Tom and the others, notarized and signed, each one a nail in the coffin of Karen's credibility. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on theatrics. She staged a protest in front of the cabin one Saturday, rallying half a dozen of her loyalists to march in circles with signs that read things like "dangerous gun owner" and "protect our community." It might have rattled me if it wasn't so absurd, but I knew the cameras were catching every moment, every insult, every trespass. When the sheriff drove by and saw it for himself, he simply shook his head and told me to keep recording. Could see the toll it was taking on her. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her smile rarely appeared anymore, and she flinched whenever the phone buzzed with another one of Karen's venomous texts. One night she broke down in tears, saying she missed the cabin's old peace, the mornings of coffee on the porch and evenings of stargazing by the dock, before Karen had poisoned everything. I held her and promised that when this was over, when Karen was finally held accountable, we'd get that peace back. For the first time, I believed it, because the walls were closing in on Karen, and she didn't even realize it. The court date came sooner than expected, thanks to the sheriff pushing the DA to fast-track the charges against her son and the civil complaint. We had filed against Karen for harassment and defamation. We walked into the courthouse that Monday morning with binders under our arms and resolve in our hearts. But my jaw nearly hit the floor when I saw Karen strutting through the doors in a bright red blazer, flanked by her son and 3 board members, like she was about to deliver the performance of her life. She spotted us immediately and smirked, leaning close enough to hiss, "You're going down today." Emily gripped my hand tightly, but I just nodded and walked past her without a word, because I knew the truth was on our side. The hearing began with Karen launching into a tirade so wild it bordered on parody. She claimed I had threatened her dozens of times with a rifle, that I had terrorized her family, that I had staged evidence to frame her son, that Emily and I were anti-community agitators, trying to destroy the HOA from within. The judge listened patiently, but raised an eyebrow more than once, especially when Karen contradicted herself mid-sentence. When it was our turn, I stood and calmly presented our evidence. The video of her son sneaking across the yard with the gas can, the audio recordings of Karen screaming threats through the fence, the notarized statements from Tom and the other neighbors, the photos of the vandalism on the gate, each piece stacked neatly upon the last, a mountain of truth that Karen couldn't climb no matter how high she raised her voice. By the time I was done, the courtroom was silent, except for Karen's heavy breathing. She tried to object to spin more lies, but the judge cut her off sharply, reminding her that this was a courtroom, not a soap opera. As we left that day, the judge announced that a decision would be made soon regarding restraining orders and damages, and Karen's face was a mask of pure fury, her lips pressed so tight they turned white. But as Emily and I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, for the first time in months, I felt hope. Hope that this nightmare was nearing its end, that the cabin might once again be ours in peace, and that Karen's reign of terror was finally cracking under the weight of her own arrogance. The week that followed our court appearance was a strange mix of relief and unease, because while Emily and I felt confident that the truth had landed like a hammer in front of the judge, Karen was more unpredictable than ever. She stormed around the neighborhood like a wounded animal, her face red and her voice hoarse as she barked accusations at anyone who so much as looked at her. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Others closed their blinds when she approached. But still, she had her loyalists, and they clung to her like barnacles on a sinking ship, repeating her lies as if saying them enough times could make them real. Emily and I tried to reclaim a sliver of normal life. We sat on the porch in the evenings again, though we kept the rifle nearby, and we dared to walk down to the dock to fish, even if our eyes were constantly scanning the tree line for Karen or her son. But peace was fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table, and one push could send it shattering to the floor. That push came one humid Thursday night, when headlights swept across the cabin walls, followed by the slam of car doors and the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice shouting my name. Emily grabbed my arm, her breath quick and shallow. I stepped outside with the rifle slung across my back, determined not to be baited, but unwilling to leave us defenseless. Karen was standing at the foot of the porch with 2 of her board members, her son lingering behind them like a shadow. "You think you humiliated me in that courtroom?" she shouted, her eyes wild, her fists clenched. "You think this is over? I run this community, and I will run you out." I told her calmly but firmly to leave. reminding her that the sheriff's report and the court proceedings were still ongoing, that she was walking dangerously close to violating the temporary restraining order that had been issued against her son. She laughed, a shrill, broken sound, and jabbed a finger toward me. "You're nothing without that gun," she sneered. "You hide behind it like a coward, but one day it won't save you." Emily whispered for me to call the sheriff, and I did, my voice steady as I reported the trespass. Karen must have realized her time was short, because she suddenly lunged forward, screaming about how the cabin was hers by right, and it took everything in me not to raise the rifle in defense. Instead, I stood my ground, my finger never once near the trigger, and told her that every second of her breakdown was being recorded. The cruiser pulled up minutes later, blue and red lights flooding the yard, and the sheriff stepped out. Exasperation, etched on his face, separated us immediately, pulling Karen aside as she wailed about conspiracies and corruption. While I handed over the fresh footage and calmly explained what had happened, Emily stood close, her hand gripping mine like a lifeline. And when the sheriff finally hauled Karen's son into the back of the cruiser for violating the restraining order, Karen shrieked so loudly it echoed across the lake. "This isn't the end," she screamed. "I'll destroy you in court. I'll take everything you love. You hear me?" The sheriff told us later that he'd be pushing for stronger measures, that the DA was taking Karen's escalating behavior very seriously now, and that the judge was likely to impose harsher penalties soon. But even with that reassurance, the night felt heavy, as if Karen's words lingered in the air long after her car disappeared down the road. Emily and I sat up late, the fire crackling low. She confessed that she no longer wanted to be strong just for the sake of being strong. She wanted it to end, truly end, once and for all. I told her I believed we were close, that Karen had finally pushed too far, but in the back of my mind, I feared what Karen might attempt if she knew her empire was crumbling. The following morning we found fresh graffiti sprayed across the dock, words too vulgar to repeat, and footprints in the mud that led straight from Karen's direction. I took photos, filed another report, and added them to the mountain of evidence. But I could feel the final confrontation building like a storm on the horizon, and as the court date for the restraining order and harassment case drew nearer, Emily and I braced ourselves, knowing Karen wasn't finished yet, that she would throw every last ounce of her rage into one final stand, and that we had to be ready to meet her there. The day of the final hearing arrived like a thundercloud, heavy with tension and the promise of a storm. And Emily and I walked into that courthouse with our binders and evidence, knowing that this was it. The day everything we had endured would either be vindicated or crushed beneath Karen's lies. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, some curious, some sympathetic, some still foolishly loyal to Karen, and the air buzzed with whispers until the judge entered and silenced them all. Karen strutted in seconds later, wearing another one of her gaudy red blazers, her chin held high, her son trailing behind with an expression that betrayed his fear even as she barked instructions at him. She glared at me as though her stare could bore holes through my skull, and when she took her seat across the aisle, she smirked in that familiar way that made my stomach churn, like she believed her performance would carry the day. The judge began by reviewing the evidence already submitted, flipping through our binders while the DA outlined the charges against Karen's son and the civil complaint against Karen herself. I sat still, my heart pounding in my ears. As video after video was shown to the court, the son creeping across our yard with the gas can, Karen shouting threats from the porch steps, the protest she staged with her loyalists chanting lies in front of our property. Every piece of evidence stacked higher and higher, a mountain that not even Karen's shrill voice could topple. When it was her turn to speak, she exploded like a firecracker, pointing at me, at Emily, at the judge himself, screaming that the entire system was corrupt, that everyone was conspiring against her, that the cabin was rightfully hers because the community belongs to me. Her voice cracked, her face flushed, and the more she ranted, the more the neighbors in the gallery began to shift uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads, others outright rolled their eyes. For the first time, I saw doubt on the faces of even her most loyal board members. Emily squeezed my hand under the table, her eyes glistening. And I realized we were finally watching Karen's mask crack wide open. The judge slammed his gavel once, cutting through the chaos. And his voice rang with authority as he declared that Karen's actions were not only reckless, but criminally negligent. He granted us a permanent restraining order, ordered Karen's son to face criminal charges for attempted arson, and imposed a hefty fine on Karen herself for harassment and defamation. But it wasn't just the legal consequences. It was the words the judge spoke after, words that carried the weight of finality. This court will not tolerate abuse of power, harassment, or intimidation. Property rights stand, and this cabin belongs to its rightful owner. Case closed. For a moment, silence filled the room, and then, like a dam breaking, voices rose in murmurs, some in support, some in shock. Karen's face twisted into something monstrous, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and then she screamed a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber before the bailiff moved to escort her out. She kicked and thrashed, shouting promises of revenge, but her words were drowned by the reality that she had lost, truly lost, for the first time in her life. Emily and I walked out into the sunlight that afternoon with our heads high, the weight of months of fear and harassment finally lifting from our shoulders. Neighbors who had once doubted us now approached to apologize, to offer handshakes and pats on the back, to admit they had been blind to Karen's manipulations. Tom grinned from ear to ear, telling me he'd never been so happy to see justice served. And when we drove back to the cabin, the sight of its weathered wood and familiar porch brought tears to Emily's eyes. That night, as we sat by the fire on the dock, the lake calm and shimmering under the stars, Emily whispered that she finally felt safe again, that the nightmares had loosened their grip, and that we could begin to heal. I wrapped my arm around her and nodded. But deep down I knew this wasn't just about safety. It was about standing up to tyranny, about proving that bullies like Karen could be defeated when you refused to bend. And as the fire crackled and the night wrapped around us, I thought of all the people who might be dealing with their own Karens, their own battles with those who abused power, and I realized our story was more than just ours. It was a reminder that no matter how loud, how manipulative, or how cruel someone might be, the truth still matters, and courage still counts. So if you've listened this far, if you've walked with us through this nightmare, let me leave you with this. Never let anyone steal your peace. Never let anyone bully you into silence, and never underestimate the power of standing your ground. Karen tried to break us. She tried to take what was never hers, but in the end, she walked out of that courtroom in handcuffs while we walked free, stronger than ever. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more battles fought and won against injustice, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, because our fight may be over, but there are countless others out there who need their stories told. Together we can shine a light on every last one.